Hi, this is Linda Rost. I'm the 2020 Montana Teacher of the Year, and I'm a top 4 national finalist. And Dr. Hicks asked if I would do a workshop at the seminar for you. And obviously that isn't happening. So he asked if I would do a video to share some of the things that I've learned throughout my career. So I wanted to first start with my background. I grew up in El Paso, Texas. I was raised by a biology professor and a math teacher, and I've always loved science. So I went to New Mexico State University to get a bachelor's of science in range science, and I minored in biology, and I also took a lot of chemistry. And I was planning to work in the science field, work for the NRCS, do research, something like that. I got married and moved to Montana, and there was a teaching job that opened up. So I thought I could do that for a year until I figured out what I was going to do. And I think that around 2 weeks in, I was hooked and I loved it. But it was also really hard. And I also didn't have any teaching training at all. I didn't have any courses. So I started on an emergency authorization, and then I started my master's right away so that I could get certified. And then I got on a provisional licensure and eventually got licensed. I finished my master's in 2010, and it was from Montana State. And then I started working on another master's somewhere in there, and I also transitioned to teaching in Baker. I finished a master's of science in science education in 2018, and now I'm working on a PhD in curriculum and instruction with a STEM specialization. And so all along I've been teaching broadfield science. I taught 7 different classes in Ekalaka. It's a really small school. And now I'm teaching 5 different preps in Baker. So I teach currently biology, chemistry, science research, anatomy and physiology, and AP bio. Is that 5? I think that's 5. So one of the things that kind of set me apart in the Teacher of the Year world was how well my students did at science research. So right away, I had students qualifying for the International Science Fair as soon as I started the class. This is my first pair that I took to the International Science Fair, and they actually placed 4th in the world with their research. So that kind of made our program stand apart. Over the years, over my 13-year career, I've had 23 students compete at national and international competitions, and quite a few of them have placed as well. So here's some pictures of them. This student placed first place in the nation at the National Junior Science and Humanities Symposium in 2012 with his research. Here's some others that have competed at the International Science Fair over the years. This student placed 4th at the International Science Fair, and the student who placed first also got 3rd at internationals. I didn't mention that. And then last year, this student competed at both the International Science Fair and the National Science and Humanities Symposium, and she placed 3rd in the nation last year. This is the total of all of my students who have competed. And I had 1 qualify so far for internationals this year, and then the state science fair was canceled and international science fair was canceled. And so this year will be a little different. And I'm sure that you all are also navigating this quarantine world and remote learning. I am also a student and a teacher in this remote world, so I'm right there with you. And I hope that you're managing well. I also have participated in a lot of professional development. I facilitated a lot of workshops and presentations throughout my career, and I've been involved in a lot of grants. And I would definitely encourage you to do that in your career. Get involved in some of these professional endeavors, and I'll tell you more about that at the end as well. But this is my very first professional presentation when I was a baby teacher, and it's evolved a lot since then. So these are some of the main points that characterize my teaching philosophy that I've developed over time. And the first point was when I spent some time during my first master's grappling between these ideas of constructivism and behaviorism. And hopefully you've had some exposure to these like sort of philosophical pedagogical concepts. And I would describe for myself behaviorism as in the classroom as when we look at students, we try to determine based on their behavior whether or not they're learning. And that can be really misleading as an educator if we're just focusing on their behavior. What does learning actually look like? And does that determine whether or not they're learning? And I can give you an example of my son. He's 8 years old, and I have he's a challenge in the traditional classroom, and I've taught him in Sunday school, and he will be the child who's over in the corner standing on his head or climbing under tables while we're doing the lesson. But then at the end of the lesson, he'll be able to explain all of it and even act it out, and he learned all of the content more than the other students. And so it's not that it's terribly appropriate or convenient for him to be doing those behaviors, but those behaviors don't determine whether or not students are learning. So that's something that I would encourage you to kind of look into and think more about if you haven't already. And then for me, constructivism would be the idea that students are constructing their understanding and that their learning can't always be seen from the outside, that there's a lot more going on under the surface than what we can see on the outside, and that our learners are actually building their understanding based on previous experiences that they've had in life. And so this has always been my mantra since the beginning, that we need to get in the heads of the learners and really help them to deconstruct sometimes misconceptions and construct their learning. And we really want to know where their foundations and foundational knowledge and experiences are and how we can build on that. And so that really comes down to what kind of connections we have with our students. These are some of the things I focus on in my teaching. I focus on the students' learning and growth over anything else. That is the number one priority. It's more important than any other part of teaching, is the learning and growth of the learner. And then I also try to develop lessons that are relevant and authentic. And so I focus on topics, especially place-based topics in Montana. We have tons of them, especially in science, but also in any subject area where we can build some really authentic place-based lessons. And with authenticity, what I mean is that when students produce work that are artifacts of their learning, they need a chance to be able to share that out with their learning community in their classroom, or even with their whole community, and sometimes even with the world. And so I would really encourage you to find ways to make sure they're doing really authentic, real learning, real life learning experiences. Another thing that I learned early on, probably my second year teaching, was that it's not about what you say. I could give the most amazing lecture and use the most poignant words. I could give this presentation perfectly and say everything perfectly, and that doesn't mean that they're going to learn the content. So the stuff that I say does not necessarily influence the learning that they do. And so when I learned that, when I realized that, that took a lot of pressure off of me, and it put more focus on the learner, took the focus off of me and put the focus on the learner. And so I was really focusing on what were they actually learning. It wasn't about what I said, it was about what they learned and how I can really connect with that and respond to it. And so I learned that it's more about what they are doing in their learning and how they're interacting with the content rather than what I'm saying. So I can design lessons really, really well to make sure that they're interacting with the content really well. And I can spend less time focusing on preparing the perfect speech, because that's maybe not going to determine their learning as much as other things. The most important thing also is that we're making connections with our students. And we need to remember that what we are doing is human work. And I think I've been able to see that really well during this remote teaching and learning transition. I was really worried about my students who were already struggling learners, and I was worried about how they were going to make this transition well. And I was right to be worried about that. And what I have found is that the students, when we see struggling learners or any learner, the best way to help them is to connect with them as humans and really show them that you care. And I think that, and I can even tell you examples of this past week where I've seen that happen with some of my students. So if we can find ways to really connect with them on a personal level and really show them that we care and take the time to really do that, that's where you're going to see a lot more learning and growth in your students. So this is a graphic that I wanted to share with you to kind of frame the next part of what I'm talking about. And I hope that you've seen something similar to this graphic, maybe a piece of it. This one's a little bit more fleshed out. One topic that we really grapple with a lot in education is equity. And there are huge inequalities and inequities in education today for a lot of different reasons. And the first picture on the left kind of shows the reality where this tallest student, they're all trying to see this baseball game over the fence. And the tallest student here has lots of crates or boxes that he is standing on, he or she. And what we see in our classrooms is that a lot of students come in with a lot of resources and life experiences that kind of facilitate their learning and put them in a different plane than the other students. And then we might have another one that we can scaffold and they can just see over the fence. And some of them actually come in with deficits. So they are coming in where they are not able to access the content and the learning like other students. And we really need to be aware of that, that's really happening, and it continues to happen. It's not like they come in and we can just fix that all of a sudden. They're still living in that space. And so one idea of what equality might look like is, well, let's just give everybody a bench or a box so they can see over the fence. And you can see that that helps two of the students, but this other student is still not able to access the learning. So equity would look more like this, where we're able to really assess how much scaffolding does each student need to be successful and to access the content and interact with the content in the best way so they can learn and grow. And so you can see here that we're giving that one student 2 stools, 2 benches, 2 boxes, but ideally we would just remove the fence, right? We would remove those barriers to learning. And so this is a really good way to frame that. But I have a little bit of a more developed idea for this. So I would argue this is our fence, this gray box, and I would argue that our students are coming in with different life experiences and different foundations. And more than just giving them more boxes to stand on, we have to actually know them and connect with them in a way that we can help tie in the new foundations we're giving them to their current foundations, and they should be customized. And so this is what that might look like. If each of our students come in with different shaped foundations, then we need to help them to build their new learning and content around the foundations they already have and connect that learning with our students. And so here's what our students might look like. But it's custom made to them because we're connecting with them, we're connecting their learning on a personal level. And so they can build their new learning based on their foundations. And ideally then we can also remove the fence, right? So I wanted to share this project actually for one of my PhD classes that I thought was kind of neat. We've been studying post-structuralism and Deleuze, who's a philosopher. And so for my project, I wanted to investigate this idea of classroom rhizomes. Rhizomes are they're like stems that grow off of plants below ground, and then stolons are above ground. So a stolon would be like a strawberry runner. So these are kind of like below ground runners, and they can actually connect to nodes and they can form more plants. So I wanted to look at what this would look like if we were relating it to a classroom and how students are making connections to each other and how the resources of knowledge and content and learning and connections are being made between different students. Through that lens, I wanted to look at seating, classroom climate, the arrangements, and different types of lessons and how that might facilitate different rhizomatous connections. And I'm always very interested in the idea of power in the classroom. Power is something that you should be able to see and feel as a teacher. You should know where it is at all time, but you should feel free to be able to give, I call it a locus of power, kind of like a talking stick almost, but you should feel free to give that to your students sometimes and know how to bring it back to you when you need to. But I would encourage you to let that power locus be fluid, let it flow. And that can facilitate a lot of opportunities for students to show leadership and a lot of other things too. So as you're watching and looking through some of this stuff, think about that power idea, and I'll try to mention it. Think about where it is and what it would look like in these different classroom settings. So this idea was based off of a master's thesis that I saw in 2018 when I graduated. And this student, this teacher, she was modeling classroom connections based on mycorrhizae in fungi. So they're kind of like rhizomes and fungi, and they branch off of the main sort of line, and they can form new nodes, and depending on where the resources are. So she wanted to look at how that relates to her students and kind of the climate and culture in her classroom. She, over the year, she mapped all of her students in this way. So she looked, and we should all do this, maybe not formally, but this should be going through our minds. So she looked at their friends, their community, their school culture, their family, their self, and she kind of mapped out what that looked like and how that shaped them as a person. It seems like a lot of work, but it's worth thinking about even in that frame of mind. And then She also mapped the classroom connections in each class. So this was over the course of the year. She collected data on this, and then she looked at how students interacted with her and how they interacted with each other. So you can see she's in the middle, the blue, and then each of the numbers represent the students. The ones who are black, those became nodes. Those were the students who tended to make a lot of connections with the teachers, and they actually served as like a middleman to other students. So they kind of passed some of that information on to other students. And then you can see some of these students way at the end that are maybe only connecting with one other student. And sometimes those connections are not even, some of those connections are even difficult. Sometimes one student will have to seek out that lone student and connect with them. So those are some things that you can notice when you are in a classroom or when you have your own classroom, some of those student dynamics. The dotted lines would be some of those students who needed extra support and they didn't seek out help on their own. And just because a student is not seeking out help on their own doesn't mean they don't need help. So you need to make sure that you're checking in with those students often and that you're really reading the climate of the classroom and kind of that landscape. So I thought that was a really interesting view of how we can look at our classrooms. This is an old schoolhouse that actually existed I live out in the country, and it was about a mile from where I live now, and it was there for like 50 years, from 1916 to 1967, and then they moved it to a museum in town. So it's a cool place. I like to go there and like think about how education has changed over the century or a couple centuries, and what it would have been like to be a teacher or a student in this classroom. And here's another view from the teacher's desk. So you can think about classrooms that you've been in and if those look similar or different to this and what it would be like to teach there. And here's a view with some 6th grade students in the classroom who were visiting. And so you can think about what their learning would be like. What I see here is that they're all doing independent seat work, and there's not a lot of collaboration. They're just all working independently on their paper, which is great. That's a great way to learn sometimes. This is how I would characterize those classroom connections if I was to sort of use that rhizome model. I would see that the teacher was like the main node, the main source of resources, and that hopefully, theoretically, they were supplying those resources and that learning to each of those students, but it was each individual. It was the teacher supplying it each individually to those students. There may be some connections between students that might have happened with like non-structured play in the playground or other ways, but for the most part, it was just individual seat work. That's how I would see that kind of classroom arrangement. This is what my classroom looks like. It's empty now, but I took these pictures early in the year. You can see I also have desks in rows. Some of them are touching. I have kind of a U-shaped thing here, and then I have these 2 rows. I have a lot of students that have to fit in a small space, and all these desks are full with my biggest classes, so it's hard to fit them, and I've tried lots of different seating. There are pros and cons to this seating. I do have a little bit more connections. We do group work even in our seats and partner work, and we have whole class discussions and small group discussions. But we also, sometimes I just do lectures, and sometimes that's one way that we can facilitate learning, and sometimes it can be good. So this is how I would show what those connections might look like. In that sense, if we arrange our furniture in that way, we might have a little bit more connections. Like I said, we might have whole group or small group discussions, and it can be good. This can be a good way to learn. The 20th century model might also be a good way to learn, but there's other ways that we can try to facilitate learning. So this is a project I wanted to share. It's a video. I have all of these videos on YouTube if you want to watch the full versions, but this is called the meiosis square dance, and this is a different way to use our classroom space. In this lesson, what I do is I have the students model meiosis, which is when we make sex cells, sperm and egg, and we separate the chromosomes. It's kind of like mitosis when we do cell division, but we do it twice, so that each of the 4 cells that we end up with have just one copy of the DNA. And so I wanted them to model this with clay. We also learned this in other ways. We did, I lectured, we did other projects, and so this was just kind of our last way to model this to kind of solidify it. It's also a great way for me to assess their learning, because I can really dig into their heads and see what they understand and what they don't. So when they walked into the room, all the seats were cleared. This is the back of the room. All the seats were cleared in the front. There was a big empty space. And I had them sit in the back so I could explain the plan. And imagine what's going through their head when they walked into the room and all their seats are like missing and they don't know where to go or what to do. So you can tell that it got their gears turning. They knew they were doing the meiosis square dance that day, but they weren't really sure what that entailed. So this first part is where I'm explaining to them what we're doing. I gave them some clay and they're using it to model chromosomes, and they're trying to understand what it is that we're doing with our bodies. I muted it so you can watch some of their body language. Watch the one in the maroon sweater listening, and then she goes back to her group. The one in the teal sweater is also listening, and then she's connecting with her group. And then watch as they come over, and I didn't invite them over. I didn't tell them, but they came over, and now they're trying to understand some of this content, and then they're going to go back to their groups to understand it better. So that's the start of it. You can see how some of those classroom connections can start. And then this is a little bit further on when we're figuring out how to model this. And I also muted this one. It works. So watch how they're showing some leadership. They're explaining to each other what to do. I gave a little bit of instruction, but it's mostly them making sense of what they're doing and trying to figure it out. And I purposely try to give them very little information so they have to make sense of it and really engage with the learning and figure out where to go. Okay, so now I wanted to show you actually in action what this looks like when they're doing the meiosis square dance, once they've gotten it all figured out. Oops. So let me see if I can click on this. And I put sound on this one so you can see what it looks like. To watch the full version, you can go to my channel. So they're trading clay, they're interacting with each other. Okay, so you can see that they're using their space in a different way. They're making connections with each other and in a way that they would not be doing during seat work, individual seat work, which is also a valid way to learn. I'm not discounting that, I do that too. But I just wanted to show you some variation. This is another project that I do with my students. This is a pinwheel discussion. And in this one, I have just 3 groups set up, but another example I'll show you has 4. So we use this a lot for a lot of different lessons, and I think this could be used in a lot of content areas and even in different grade levels. I've taught this even to this method to like, I think as low as 1st grade teachers. So maybe it could be used in some way. So basically what we do is, I use these a lot for Indian Ed for All lessons. I build lessons in mostly biology where we are discussing like provocative, controversial topics and how that relates to Indigenous values and some of the tribes. One example is the delisting of the grizzly bear, and 2 of the tribes in Montana, the Salish Kootenai and the Blackfeet, actually sued the government, the US government, for delisting the grizzly bear for a variety of reasons. So basically we spend a few days learning about the topic, and each student is divided into different groups. We have a tribal council member group, we often have a tribal scientist group, we have like a state scientist group, and then we might have like a provocateur. In this one, we had a US district court judge. And so they spend a few days learning about the topic in their groups and discussing some different like discussion questions about the topic. And then the last day, we do this pinwheel discussion where they each sit in their groups, and then one person from each group goes into the middle to do the pinwheel discussion on one of the discussion questions, and then they rotate. So each of them is in the hot seat once. And you can imagine like what the connections are happening over that time period with the students in the groups. And sometimes I even give them individual jobs so they become the experts on a certain facet of that topic. So they really have to learn that and showcase it and share it out with their group. And then they also have to be the expert of representing their group when they go into the pinwheel. Here's kind of what that looks like if we were to model this with our rhizomatous connections. When we're doing the first part, They're forming connections within their groups when they're learning about the topic. And then when we do the pinwheels, they are making connections with their new group. And then we have timeout sessions where they can take a timeout and discuss if they're stuck or something, or they need some help. And so this is a really great way to form intentionally some of those connections between students and really get students out of their shell and really get them engaged in the topic. They get super engaged. They love, like I think like some of them have said things like, I live for pinwheels. And I think there's bumper stickers and things like that. But what you would notice, you might notice that something's missing in this one graphic. And what is missing is the teacher. And I would encourage you to find ways to have students engage in discourse where the teacher is just like the guide on the side that's just facilitating and is not involved in the discussion. Sometimes it's really hard to get students to step into this space where they're leading their discussions and they're like leading their learning because they're not used to it. But I would encourage you to try to find ways for students to get into that mindset where they can be the lead in a lot of ways, and it doesn't have to be the teacher. And so I have an example. We did one of these recently and I was gone. I was sick. And so I got on Zoom with them and I watched them lead the whole pinwheel. I had a sub. He was just like a warm body in the room, and they led the whole pinwheel while I watched. So that was really powerful for me to see that in real life with me just watching. This is another project that I've done where students are engaging in discourse, and I see a lot of constructivism in these lessons where they're building their own understanding together. And I obviously did some direct instruction, but at this point in this lesson, they're learning it on their own. When we do lessons like this, it's always good to remember to wrap things up at the end. So you might start small and then funnel out and let them explore, but always remember to come back and close it up so they have a nice package at the end and they can really package up their learning. So maybe that would be with an essay question or something like that, so they can really close that up. But here's an example. I set up the lesson for them and they're exploring it on their own.
Use these for a while. We'll plant, plants and animals, and then
I feel like these would be the Monair. Basic.
Yeah,
Look for basic.
Yeah.
Just little tubes and little specks.
So you can see the engagement of each student and how they're each exploring. And think about that contrasted with what that 20th century classroom would look like if you were doing a similar lesson to this, if you wanted to teach the same content, and what that would look like. And which way would be the best way to teach? And it's possible that it's the other way. It's possible that it's the individual seat work. So you really need to look at what is it that you're trying to teach them? What is the content, and what is the best way to do that for your particular learners? And it may be different in the classroom next door. So those are some ideas to talk about, and I would really encourage you to think about how you're connecting students to each other and how you're connecting those resources, because all students are not always going to connect to the teacher. There are different dynamics and cultures that can inhibit that, and so we just need to make sure that we're connecting as a community of learners. This is another type of lesson that I do with inquiry, and you could probably do this in another way in different content areas, but it works really well in science. You can definitely do it in any grade level. So this is a really simple framework that I use for these inquiry lessons, where I bring students back to the lab tables in groups. And this is what we do for a fire lesson. So this is early in the year when we're learning lab safety. I light a Bunsen burner and put it in the middle of the table, and it's when they walk in, it's on. And they sit at their desks and they have to design testable questions and then design an experiment from that. The first part is totally individual. They're not allowed to talk, and then they can share out. And I can assess them really well in terms of how many testable questions they can come up with. And I can see them grow over time to see how much better they get. So this is an example of, there are times when individual seat work is really important, and there are times when we can do it collaboratively for sure. Oops. Let me play that first video so you can see what that looks like. And all of you are sitting at tables with flames. Sorry for my camera skills. What you're going to do first is you're going to sit quietly and look at the flame and zen with the flame and think about the flame. And I want you to write down 5 testable questions that you could design experiments for in your notebook. So a testable question is not like, why is the flame blue? A testable question is something you can do an experiment with. So I want you each to write down 5 questions, and nobody can talk while we're doing this. After you all have 5, then you guys can share and decide which one you're going to do an experiment with. Okay, ready, go. Okay. And then this is them later. So they wrote their questions. I can assess those questions. They share it out. They choose one. They design an experiment. And this is them trying to figure it out. And you can notice I'm not involved in this conversation.
So like one measurement here, like one up here and one up here, and then the same for the edge.
Yeah. How close can we hold like a ruler to that? Or should we use a ruler?
Well, we could have I'm trying to think. We could have like one of those rod things, and then get like a piece of tape and put it around there, and then put like marker stuff on it, and we could have it like by it, so then we can.
Okay, so you can see that they're trying to figure out what they're going to do for their experiment, and I'm not part of that conversation. And you can do this at any age level. As I was watching, I was thinking about you could germinate seeds, you could work with yeast. There's a whole bunch of different experiments that you could do. You're just letting them design it. And when I first started doing this, I would start with a lab that I already used, and I wouldn't give them the paper. I would just say, okay, today we're going to do an experiment with yeast respiration, and I would like for you to design it. And you can choose to change the temperature, the type of sugar, all these parameters, and they would design that experiment themselves instead of doing a cookbook lab. So those are some really great ways to facilitate inquiry and use student connections to do that. And I think that you also have to ask yourself, when you're designing lessons like this, what is the classroom going to feel like and look like and sound like? And you have to be okay with, if it's a chaotic lesson, it's a chaotic lesson. If there's a lot of noise and activity, decide that ahead of time. What is it going to look like? What should it look like? What should your learners look like? And have that in mind and kind of picture it and visualize it ahead of time, because otherwise I think some of these lessons can be kind of scary and overwhelming. And maybe take baby steps, because it can be a lot, but they're super engaged, and this is where really heavy learning happens. So this is what our classrooms probably look like now. You may or may not be engaging in synchronous meetings like this. These are some of my peers in my PhD program. I don't have any of my students right now, but and that one guy has a beer. But I was thinking about how our connections to our teachers look like now in this setting, and I think it might look more like that 20th century straight rows, when we are only connecting with our teachers in this remote, this distance learning. And I think that we should be aware of that, and I think there are also ways where we can keep students connected, because that student connection is really important. They can learn a lot from each other. And so if you find yourself in this setting as a teacher, which could happen if in the fall or later, I think that you should keep these things in mind and try to find ways to facilitate some of these connections in any setting. So I really thought that this rhizome analogy was helpful to me. I hope it was helpful to you to maybe kind of deconstruct the classroom and see things in a different light and really focus on learning instead of what you think your classroom should look like. So I would encourage you to remember that your classroom doesn't have to look like the one across the hall. It doesn't have to look like classrooms that you had in your childhood. It's your own, and you get to be you, and you get to build that climate and that atmosphere in the best way that you see fit, and it can evolve and change to respond to your learners. And so give yourself the freedom to invent your classroom and your teaching style to fit you and your learners only. And this is just a nod to some of my dissertation research. I'm focusing on the teacher shortage. I'm focusing on teacher retention, keeping teachers in the classroom and not so much recruitment. And I'm really interested in rural reservation schools and rural schools and how to get teachers here and get them to stay. And I'm also really interested in STEM teaching. So if you are a STEM teacher, yay. If you're an elementary teacher, STEM teaching in elementary is amazing. And I also want to mention the Masters of Science and Science Education program from Bozeman. We had tons of elementary teachers in that program, and it is outstanding. So if you're looking at a great master's degree, super fun and challenging, great classes, great professors, and it's really affordable, I really recommend that Masters of Science in Science Education. It's montana.edu/MSSE. So this is my advice slide to end with. And my number one piece of advice or guidance would be to make sure you're connecting with each learner as a human, at a human level. Know them like you want to be known. So that's the very first step, and that's really going to promote learning probably more than anything else. Remember that your students are not robots. They don't have to look like robots. They don't have to all be sitting in straight desks, all doing the exact same thing, all learning in the exact same way, because that's not how humans work, fortunately. And we've all heard that and we all know that, but do it. Like, just remember it. And I think that our 19th, 20th century model of education was built on that idea that they are robots or clones, and they're not. So we need to let go of that. We really need to move past that. And don't get stuck in that clone robot mindset. And make sure that you are focusing on their learning and growth above all else. I do see a lot of classrooms that focus more on a power structure and dominance, and that's how they get learning out of their students. And I would really recommend that you step away from that. That's not a sustainable way to build lifelong learners. You want them to love learning and to do the learning because they love the learning and not because they're afraid or because they have this power structure. And I think that power structure can still be there in some ways. It just doesn't have to be so prominent. So get them to love the learning and do the learning for that reason. And again, get inside their heads and help them to construct their own learning. And if I go back to the previous bullet, on the power idea, remember to look at where that power is in your classroom. And I should have mentioned it more in the videos, but hopefully you could see that power was shifting when the students were doing their group work, that the power locus was there. There were many of them. Each group had their own, and I was not a part of that. And that's how it was supposed to be. And then sometimes I take that back and I exercise my right to have that power. But we definitely need to recognize that can move, and it should. And remember that you can be you, and your classroom doesn't have to look like anyone else's. It can just be you, and give yourself permission to just be you and focus on these things and not what you think it should look like. And then finally, you should be the lead learner in your classroom. You should always be a learner first before you're a teacher. And your main learning that you're doing is you're learning how to teach, and you're learning how people learn, how humans learn. And your students are like your subjects that you're, not like your kingdom subjects, but they're the ones that you're studying, number one. So always be learning from them about learning. You can also learn about learning from other places like scientific, like journals, educational research, magazines, other literature like that, alongside your students. And then I would also encourage you to make sure that you are always doing the hard learning. And so we talk about this idea of lifelong learners, and we should all be lifelong learners, but I think it goes a step past that. I don't think that means that we should take guitar lessons or learn how to ski. I think it means that we should always be challenging ourselves and learning something that's really hard for us, that really stretches us. I've been teaching chemistry for 13 years, and frankly, sometimes it's frustrating because I think it's really easy and they don't. And if you're teaching first graders reading for 20 years, you might start thinking the same thing. Why don't they get this? This is so easy. And so we need to always be in that space where we're learning really hard stuff that's really genuinely hard for us, so we remember what it's like to be a 6-year-old and be learning what the heck letters mean and making sense of words. So always be in that space where you're doing really hard learning. And then I would also encourage you to do this, and I talked about this at the beginning. Pick one extra thing every year that you're doing. Maybe you are involved in a grant. There's some really great grants. Maybe you're doing the Teacher Leadership Institute. Maybe you're working on your master's. Maybe you're doing your MSSE. Maybe you are working on national boards someday. Pick one program or one effort that can really grow you as an educator and do that every year. And pick well. Pick something that you think will really grow you, like a great program. And if it's not working out, then pick something else. So that's my challenge to you. I want you to really commit to that, because we need to make sure that we're in that hard place and we're really growing so that we can remember what it's like to be a learner. So this is some of my contact information, and I really wish that I had the opportunity to connect with you guys in real life and not be just staring at my computer screen at the little white light where my camera is. So I would love to hear from you. I hope that I someday get to meet some of you when things are different. This is my email, so please, please, please feel free to email me anytime. Email me right now. Just find ways to connect. You can also find me on Twitter. That's my handle. And then I'm on Facebook. I have a professional page, and then I have a personal page, and you can friend me on either or both. And then I also have a YouTube channel. I have tons of videos on there. All the ones I shared, the full videos are on there if you want to watch more. And they're just like real life, what goes on in my classroom. So you can kind of see what maybe unconventional classroom might look like. And you might catch a glimpse of my bearded dragon Quigley. See if you can find a video with him in there. So if you have any questions or just want to connect, please feel free to email me, and I hope I get to meet some of you someday. Talk to you later.